Welcome to the Gold Newsletter Podcast, your bank of knowledge of investment, economics, and geopolitics. Go to goldnewsletter.com for our publications and archives.
This is Fergus Hodgson with the Gold Newsletter Podcast in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. So pleased to be with you. I'm excited because I'm at the Adam Smith Society event on the future of financial services, and we have many brilliant people here. It's humbling for me to be alongside these talented people. And last night we heard from Caitlin Long about her work to make Wyoming a home for the blockchain space, both in the United States and internationally. And I'm excited to speak with her. She is a 22-year Wall Street veteran and now the leader of the policy innovations or developments here. Caitlin, welcome to the Gold Newsletter Podcast. You are a Wyoming native, but why else is Wyoming suitable for such a project?
Thanks, Fergus. Well, Wyoming has a long history of innovation and, believe it or not, business innovation. But let me start, because of the title of your podcast, by saying Wyoming is one of 2 states in the United States that recognize specie as legal tender. So that tells you a lot about where Wyoming's coming from. We also are the state that invented the limited liability company. And we're actually number 2 behind Delaware in terms of business registrations for businesses. And that was a long fight, as I understand it. The LLC was created here in Wyoming in 1977, but the IRS didn't issue the no action letter until the 80s. And Delaware wasn't happy about what Wyoming was doing and fought it initially, is my understanding. But subsequently, once they realized that there was something here, Delaware embraced it and frankly made it better and overtook Wyoming in new business registration. So there is a history of innovation here.
Actually, one thing that stood out to me, which would be maybe music to the ears of people listening, is that you said that Wyoming is just ironclad in protecting the privacy of people who register their LLCs here. Do you want to explain that?
Wyoming statute requires only the name and address of the contact person for a business. You don't have to disclose who your partners are or the beneficial owners. And you can, if you use an attorney, you can actually have your attorney's name, and you actually get the protection of attorney-client privilege when setting up an LLC. The interesting question came up a few years ago when Wyoming LLCs were frequently used in the Panama Papers, and there were some folks in the legislature here who were concerned about that and thought we ought to actually sort of get with the program, so to speak, and start doing what everybody else is doing, which is collecting an enormous amount of data on every business. And the legislature considered it and voted it down by a veto-proof majority. They said, nope, we like our privacy here. So there's a rugged individualism ethos here that fits very well with business innovation and with the cryptocurrency sector specifically.
That actually appealed to me enormously, that you are a classical liberal, if I can put it that way, and yet you're able to actually get legislation passed. I cannot believe it.
You know, some people actually threw a lot of shade at me for even bothering to do this because they thought it was illegitimate to even be working with the legislature and to be appointed by the governor to a task force. I was volunteer. I wasn't paid. The whole thing, by the way, the whole thing for the last almost now 2 years has been volunteer. It's a passion project for me, and it just helps me give back to the native state I love so much, but also to the industry that philosophically I'm so in tune with, because it does devolve power back to regular folks and allows a lot of us not to have to be trapped in a financial system that forces us to be in a debtor-creditor relationship with all of our counterparties. But yeah, you know, it's an interesting question. One of my classical liberal mentors said to me, you are the modern day equivalent of fighting the red flag laws. And he was referring to the British version of the red flag laws, not the American red flag laws regarding firearms that are being discussed today. That the British version of red flag laws were when the automobile came out. There was a law in Britain that required someone to be walking in front of the car, waving a red flag, warning pedestrians that an automobile was coming. And that law prompted the automobile industry, which had already been starting to take off in Britain, to move to the United States. And so Britain lost its innovation as a result of this crazy regulation. Even, it's an interesting question for classical liberals. I think if we didn't have anything other than natural law, that participating in the legislative process would be illegitimate. But the problem is we have all these crazy things like those old red flag laws in Britain that have to be torn down. And so participating in the legislative process to try to tear down those barriers is, I think, legitimate and is consistent with the classical liberal philosophy.
Yeah, so much to say about this. And one reason why this Wyoming development, which I'll get you to explain, is so relevant is that New York has introduced the bit license program, and I've written about this before. We'll post a link to my review of the Bitcoin, the movie. There's a film review which addressed this very well. And so your hope is that Wyoming can basically say, New Yorkers, we're going to offer you a better deal. And in fact, you're even optimistic that somehow Wyoming can allow people to get around the bit license. How is that possible?
Well, the answer is that in financial services regulation, there's a hierarchy. The lowest level of regulation and the lowest capital commitment in order to get a license is money transmitter licenses, which are done by the states. FinCEN also has a money transmitter license, but that's more aimed at anti-money laundering. But so the bottom of the rung is money transmitter licenses. Then the next one up is trust companies, so more capital, more regulation. Then the next one up is state chartered banks. Then the next one up is national banks. And then at the very top is the primary dealers who deal directly with the Fed. As you're going up that pyramid, the regulatory requirements go up by a lot and the capital requirements go up by a lot. So the bit license would fit in that hierarchy between money transmitters and state chartered banks. But state chartered banks actually are senior to the bit license, therefore. And there are actually laws on the books that prohibit states from discriminating against other states' state chartered banks. And so the fascinating question is, can New York discriminate against a non-New York state chartered bank? Someone will be testing that, I think, relatively soon. There's a legal opinion that's being worked on right now in Wyoming that would specify that it would actually be illegal. That's not to say that New York will respect that, but we'll find out, I think, in the next year.
That leads to the next question. I think you said there are 3 pieces of legislation you have supported or assisted, facilitated, maybe more. What are these and how do they relate to the state chartered bank status?
Yeah, there are actually a total of 13. There were 5 passed in the first year and 8 this year in the 2019 legislative session. We have 7 more proposed for 2020. And some of them are minor, some of them are much more major. I would highlight probably the most important one is that a law was passed that Wyoming cannot tax crypto assets. There's no income tax in Wyoming already, but this clarified that ad valorem taxes, which are property taxes, cannot be applied to crypto assets. And because they're considered intangible property and sales taxes only apply to tangible property, there's no sales tax either. That's probably the most important one. But then the next one is also a critical one, which is we defined under commercial law the exact status of these assets, so that if there is a legal dispute, a judge can't step in and interfere with your freedom to contract on the Bitcoin blockchain, for example. A lot of folks think if they possess the keys, they possess the asset. The challenge is none of us live outside of a legal regime unless you're living on a seastead somewhere where there is no law. And so law can step in and interfere. And if there is not an opportunity, if there is not clarity under a legal regime, that's where you start to get the risk that a judge will step in and try to interfere and reverse your transactions. And this sounds like an edge case. Admittedly, it is. I'm not aware of any litigation relating, for example, Bitcoin, where a judge tried to reverse a transaction. But what's happening now is there's a lot of lending happening in the industry, and there are liens, L-I-E-Ns, liens being created on those assets, and you can't track those liens on the Bitcoin blockchain. So the challenge with that is that you could innocently purchase a Bitcoin that was subject to a lien, and a judge may come after you and try to take your Bitcoin back. And this is what we are trying to get ahead of. That is an attack vector on crypto assets, and we want to clarify exactly what happens in those situations and prevent a judge from trying to interfere with your ability to transact directly on the blockchain.
The Gold Newsletter podcast is proudly sponsored by the Discovery Group of Exploration and Development Companies. To learn more about our exceptional track record and exciting future, visit discoverygroup.ca.
Welcome to our weekly interview with the Discovery Group, which is our proud sponsor at the Gold Newsletter podcast. I'm Daniel Duarte, editor of this podcast, and I'm joined today by Stephen Swatton, who is president and CEO of K2 Gold Corp, which is based in Vancouver. Stephen, let's jump right into it. The Discovery Group has a remarkable track record of success across a number of areas, including mining. Can you please talk about where K2 fits into that mix?
Yeah, sure. K2 is a company that was formed as a rollback of one of the previous companies. And K2 is a bit of a tongue-in-cheek for enact too. It was originated with a project in the Yukon. But as you've probably seen from the recent news, we've now migrated to California. It's not to say that the Yukon property is lacking merit. In fact, it is a very strong property. It's just that we just felt that the shareholder, because of the strength of the Discovery Group, we could probably take on a more advanced project. So we identified the project that we have in California based on a recommendation from the person who works next door to me in Discovery Group, Chris Taylor, who you probably are aware of with Great Bear.
Yes.
He's actually worked on this property in the past, and he earmarked it for us to take a look at. And I'm more than happy to tell you a little bit more about that project, but it really is a spectacular project.
So you mentioned Camina Gold, which was a previous company in the group. K2 seems to be focused on the highest potential area of junior mining, which is grassroots discovery. Can you please discuss any similarities with K2?
Most of the companies in the Discovery Group, apart from Bluestem, start out as an incubator company with an idea, with a concept. And the concept for K2 was to try and replicate what we have discovered, and it was sold for $527 million by John Robbins a few years ago now. And we have a project that has the hallmark of being similar geology. The issue, if there is one with Yukon, is you've got a very short weather window to work with if you're in exploration. Consequently, you have about 8 months of the year with very little news. So with the strength that we have within the group in the exploration space, we look for a more advanced exploration in a sunnier climate. And the U.S. at the moment is very well supported, I think, in the investment community. So we cast our net wide and we looked in all states, the mining states, and California came out with a project based on Chris Taylor's recommendation as being the strongest that we looked at. And I've been down 5 times now, and I can tell you it's 50 square kilometers of impressive looking rock.
Right, that's fascinating. And a number of Discovery Group companies are known for having made big moves in the market, but K2 seems to be at a much earlier stage. Can you tell me how it compares in value to other, perhaps comparable exploration companies?
Within the group, I'd say the other one would be Ethos Gold. We're a 12 million market cap company at the moment. We have 56 million out fully diluted, and I think it's 44 issued and outstanding. The reality is that all of the incubator type companies have values between about 5 and say 15 million. We're sort of at the upper range, and I could be corrected, but I think there's 8 companies, of which Great Bear is the most well known at the moment. But this time last year, if you looked at the market cap of that company, it would be pretty similar range to where we are right now, only as a result of Chris Taylor's foresight and his team's incredible exploration experience in the Red Lake District that they came to that. And I think we're going to transpose that level of expertise into K2 right now. And Chris Taylor is actually an advisor on our company, so we know we're on a pretty good wicket at the moment with the company. In terms of its exploration potential, there's already a lot of drill holes on this property, so we kind of are halfway up the learning curve as to developing something that is going to be of significant interest to the shareholders.
Can you tell me about the future for K2? What are perhaps some potential catalysts for higher share prices that maybe a retail investor or potential shareholder can look forward to?
Yeah, good question. We have 8 known targets on the property, of which only 2 have been looked at in the past. Newmont Mining and BHP have drilled it in the past, both with significant mineral intersections in all of the drill holes that they looked at. There's an undrilled trench of 42 meters of 4 grams that has never been looked at before. So what we're going to do is we're going to go in and do some ground surface exploration for the next several months whilst applying for a drill permit to drill a significant number of holes on the ground. But at the moment we're assessing all different aspects of it. We're doing a spectral survey at the moment. We may well do some geophysics. But the nice thing about this property is that we already know pretty well the nuances of the geology types. We don't have a handle on where all the mineralization is, But if I look at previous reports from BHP, Newmont, and Great Bear, we know we're on to a significant mineral find. The geology is not going to be an issue with us in finding more oxide resources. We already know it's there based on previous work since the 1990s.
I see. Well, Stephen, we have run out of time, but thank you so much for your time, and we look forward to hearing more about K2 Gold.
I really appreciate it. Thanks very much for taking the call.
This is in response to something you mentioned last night, which many of us have been aware of, but really haven't known the finer details, what you described as phantom stocks or phantom assets, and that basically it's almost like fractional reserve banking, but in the share market, where there are more stocks in existence on paper than actually do exist, right? In the gold space, there's a strong view that there are more gold shares than there is actually physical gold. And you said if you don't have the title of something, you don't really own it, right? How is Wyoming seeking to resolve this problem?
Well, you're absolutely right, and this gets back to we want clarity of property rights, and that's why defining the rights and obligations of the parties is so critical. This is very basic, boring stuff, but if you don't have clarity, then you end up in a gray area, and a judge may someday try to reverse your transaction. So Wyoming has a very clear philosophy of good fences make good neighbors. We define those boundaries very clearly, and Johnson County Cattle War was fought over fencing of the West. And so there's a history here of wanting to have clarity so that we don't have friction, and you're absolutely right. The New York financial world went to town in the last, it really dates back 50 years, but especially in the last 30, creating more claims to securities than are validly issued. There's a court case called Dole Foods, a Delaware Chancery Court case from 2017, so you can go look it up, and sure enough, the company was in litigation after a merger. There were 36.7 million shares outstanding. The lawsuit was settled. Everybody got an additional, $1.25 per share. They expected 36.7 million claims to be filed, and in fact there were 49.2 million claims to be filed, all of which were backed up by valid brokerage statements. Now, I already, by the time that case came out, was on to this from my personal experience in the pension world, where I saw a custodian couldn't deliver securities that were listed as being in the brokerage account for a pension fund because they didn't have them. Well, so here's where you get into this legal gray area where you don't have clear property rights to your securities. Same way you don't have clear property rights to your bank deposits. Technically, of course, the brokerage account owed those securities to the pension fund, but they didn't have them, and guess what? They didn't have to have them. The laws have been so captured, especially in the securities industry, by the banks, so that they can play these three-card Monte games. If you step back and think about it, why does it take 2 days to settle a securities trade? We are in a technology revolution where things happen in milliseconds. And yet, it takes 2 days to settle a security trade. Why is it? And the answer is that there are people making a lot of money off that regime because of all the securities lending that's happening. And that was what was happening in that pension example that I mentioned. The custodian was lending out the pension fund's securities, and the pension fund was taking, therefore, a lot of risk and not being paid for it at all. Their pocket was being picked. This kind of stuff, there are so many versions of this in the securities industry, and Wyoming is clearly pushing back against that and saying, hey, we have this crypto technology now. The old traditional system is way too far gone, but to the extent that people start issuing assets in these immutably secure, encrypted technologies with an absolute cap on the quantity that can be shared, that can be purchased. I'm describing, for example, Bitcoin in that scenario. Or you can actually now start issuing shares like IBM shares or Apple shares in a format where you can actually verify electronically that the share you're purchasing was validly issued, so that you're not getting one of those phantom shares. The technology exists to do that now, and so the world's going to be moving towards that technology because it is fundamentally fair, and what we have today is not.
Last night I discussed with you that I hadn't been aware of all these developments in Wyoming, which is crazy. It's not getting the publicity it deserves. So how can people follow your work or follow Wyoming, and maybe what action can they take on this aside from considering the LLC? I mean, you mentioned someone who actually physically just came and moved here. You came home to come here, but What actions can we take now that we're aware that Wyoming is really seeking, within the United States and maybe internationally, lead the charge in terms of changing the game?
Well, there are lots of different ways individuals can protect themselves and avail themselves of Wyoming's laws in crypto, one of which is just set up a Wyoming LLC as your investment vehicle, and instead of buying things directly as an individual, you buy them through a Wyoming LLC or a Wyoming trust. And therefore, you become a Wyoming quote-unquote person under the law, and so you can avail yourself of the protections. Some people are actually physically storing their private keys in Wyoming to avail themselves of their protections. There are custodians that are setting up. One of the things Wyoming does have is a lot of abandoned missile silos, and so those make pretty good cold storage vaults for coins. Certainly, you can move here, and by the way, a lot of people are Wyoming residents for tax purposes because, I mean, we're sitting here in Jackson Hole. The joke in Wyoming is the billionaires are pushing the millionaires out. So many people have moved into Wyoming for tax residency status, and it's not just Jackson, there are other towns in Wyoming where this is happening. I drove up yesterday from Cheyenne. Just south of Jackson is clearly a millionaire's enclave. East of Jackson and Du Bois is another one. Sheridan is another one. Saratoga. I mean, especially when Trump took off the SALT deduction, that's really pushed a lot of people, I think, to change to a tax-friendly state for residency purposes. And boy, I've seen, we left the New York area, and the housing market was just a disaster where we were, and values down 20 or 30%. In fact, it makes me question whether the banks are even solvent in that part of the country as a result of that. But then I came out here and it's the polar opposite, because so many people are actually moving here. And I worry a little bit as a native Wyomingite, because part of that culture is that we are rugged individualists, and we do not want to be importing a bunch of hypocritical tax escapees who are going to come in and vote for income taxes in Wyoming. And that, by the way, that's what happened. That's what happened in Colorado. Yeah, it used to be a reliably red state with low taxes, not no taxes, but low taxes. My sister, when she moved there, called it a big cow town, 40 years ago, Denver, and it's not anymore. It's got a lot of the big city problems and the big city taxes to go with it.
Breaking my heart a little bit there. But you didn't tell us, you said your work appears in different outlets or places.
Oh, I'm sorry. I got going on a tangent. I publish a blog, caitlin-long.com. Also, I'm very active on Twitter. That's probably the easiest place to find me, at @CaitlinLong_. Also, I write for Forbes. So just go to Forbes.com and type in my name. And I tend to publish not very often on Forbes, but pretty in-depth thought pieces about the intersection between financial services and this new crypto world.
This crypto world is evolving so rapidly, that makes it harder to write a full book on the topic. But are there any that you recommend?
It's funny. I've been trying to write one for a couple of years, and I just get sidetracked, and I'm a slow writer. I fully recommend, especially for your audience, a book called The Bitcoin Standard by Seyfedin Amos. He is an economist who wasn't a true Austrian, but he's converting over to that. And he gives an unbelievable history of money in the first 2/3 of the book. So even if you're not a crypto enthusiast, it's worth reading his book for that reason alone. And then the last third of the book is the philosophy of crypto. And another person whose work I would follow, he hasn't written a book, but he goes by the Twitter handle Plan B. He works for a Dutch bank. And he's done an amazing amount of statistical modeling about the Bitcoin blockchain and why Bitcoin has the value that it has. I'll tease everybody there because he's onto something very, very important, which is that the price of these intangible monetary assets, or even tangible like gold, the price of monetary assets isn't tied to the fact that it's backed by something. It's all subjective, of course, as we know, but it's really tied to the scarcity of the asset. That's what gives it monetary value. And throughout history, there's one asset that has been provably scarce that became money across time and across different civilizations, and that's gold. And what's fascinating about the crypto revolution is that we will soon have an asset that is digitally scarce. And in fact, actually, the stock to flow ratio of it is going to be higher than gold. So, in other words, the annual dilution that you get from producing new assets is going to be less than that of gold. And that is fascinating. We have never had something with a stock to flow ratio higher than, I think gold is about 57. So in other words, I think the annual inflation rate of gold is 1.6%, something like that. And silver, by the way, has essentially lost its monetary value because the stock-to-flow ratio has gone to about 3. Diamonds have a very high stock-to-flow ratio, for example, and this work of Plan B, of correlating the value of these different monetary assets to their stock-to-flow ratio, it will make everybody think. And I'm not sure what in the end becomes money, but I do know that there are provably scarce assets out there, and I want a place on those ledgers.
We'll finish it off there. Thank you.
Thank you.